Ali Tavallaei, thanks for joining the MedTech Unboxed podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. It seems to me that there's a lot going on in the peripheral artery disease space, PAD, at least from the device side. I know that Abbott came out with a bioreabsorbable stent. There's another company that Ephemeral that has a interesting stent technology. There's a lot of work being done on the polymer side for bioreabsorbables. And I had somebody on the podcast recently from Solaris Medical to talk about their drug-eluting stent graft. So that's all related to PAD. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the challenge that you're tackling and really in access and crossing these lesions. So I'm looking forward to that. And I was reading an article that you were part of. I think it was IEEE, ASME, and I was stunned by some of the metrics in that article about just in North America alone. I think 12 to 14% of the population suffer from PAD, and revascularization has, the 30% incidence of, failure because of the crossing. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but I was really shocked when I read all that. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about the CathPilot steerable catheter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it is unfortunately a standing issue and a major clinical problem. So globally, more than 230 million adults actually suffer from peripheral artery disease. And as you mentioned, many of these patients have to go under, revascularization procedures, and it is a massive market, but it's also a major clinical need. More than 3 million such procedures are being done globally, about 1 million actually in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, as you pointed out, and as validated by two randomized clinical studies, unfortunately, we have very high failure rates. About 15 to 20% of such procedures fail when you're trying the endovascular approach, which is the first and most common approach. And unfortunately, when that happens, the chances of repeat failures are high. And many of these patients are not necessarily eligible for open bypass, and they could become out of options essentially. And unfortunately, the sad reality is we have about 470,000 amputations each year globally, because we fail to come up with a better solution to help revascularize these patients. And just think about that number. I mean, it's a population of a large city. I mean, every year being amputated. And it's not just the amputation. You can imagine the costs of that for the healthcare system, right? Once you're amputated, just imagine going through that process. I mean, the depression and the change of lifestyle that comes with it greatly contributes to the demise of those patients. And a sad reality is when you look at the mortality rates of those amputated patients, it can be up to 80%. So a lot of them, unfortunately, die within a 5-year period. So yeah, it is a standing issue, and we do need better problems for it. And that's what we've been trying to address at Magellan Biomedical with the CathPilot technology.
Okay. Yeah, the unfortunate amputation that you mentioned and the mortality and sometimes people don't think about how it affects the entire family, right? The stress level on everybody. So I'm interested to learn a little bit more about how you could help with this issue. And so why don't you get into tell us a little bit about Magellan Biomedical and partnerships you have, and then we can get into some of the unmet needs in the CathPilot steerable catheter.
Sure. Magellan Biomedical, it really came out of the work that I was working on when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Sunnybrook Research Institute in Toronto, and we were actually studying different devices and studying how they actually interact with specific lesions or segments of the occlusion. We were trying to characterize to see how these different devices actually perform in crossing such occlusion. And one of the things that we found was when you hold these occlusions in your hand and you try to go through them with a wire, you actually see that uh, there's always a penetrable segment. We were always able to cross these occlusions when we were holding these arterial occlusion samples from patients who unfortunately were amputated. So obviously the procedures had failed; they could not
Mm.
cross them. But it beg the question, if you have this lesion and from more than 30 samples that we had, and you can always go through, why were they unable to cross them in an actual clinical case and revascularize them? Because typically that's how these patients, the procedures fail and they end up being amputated. So that really led to the fundamental question, like, well, what is the limitation of existing conventional devices that's leading to this failure? And I was very lucky that my supervisor, Dr. Graham Wright, who led the Shuley Carp research program at Sunnybrook at the time, and the clinicians that I was working with, Dr. Andrew Dueck, head of vascular surgery, and at the time, Dr. Tricia Roy, she was a PhD student. She was a vascular surgery resident and a PhD student, but now she's at Houston Methodist as a surgeon and scientist. But I was working with these amazing colleagues and on this project, and we sort of all agreed that this is a fundamental problem, and we ended up characterizing the actual need and validating that need, and then eventually my supervisor had given me sort of free roam to sort of explore various options to come up with a solution, and that's how this technology was sort of born. And I would be happy to discuss, what the underlying issue was and how it led to the CathPilot, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. You had some good slides on your website that indicated, the accuracy. You talked a little bit about pinpointing the location to cross, and then there's, these prolapse issues with the guide wire, right? If you can kind of go through some of those challenges.
Absolutely. So when typically we're working with all these cardiovascular procedures, not just peripheral
Mm.
angioplasty and revascularization, but any cardiovascular interventions, we're working with a long, flexible device known as a catheter. Now, the challenge with the catheter is because it's very long and because it's super flexible and because you're manipulating it from outside the patient body while the shaft of that catheter is engaging with this long and tortuous anatomy, control of the tip, which is what we care about, becomes very
Mm.
difficult. And when we're talking about peripheral, angioplasty, what does this mean? Well, the procedure for its success needs at least three different elements. One of them is for the clinician to see where they are and where they're going. But unfortunately, they're guiding this under 2D projection X-ray fluoroscopy, so they lack that 3D visualization. So the other aspect of is for the success of the procedure is steerability. But unfortunately, as I said, it's a long, flexible device. You don't have control over the tip. You're
Mm.
manipulating it proximally. And the third element that's needed for the success is for you to provide enough support for that wire or device or catheter to interact with the tissue. In this case, to cross the occlusion, which needs a lot of force. So in other words, we have these three elements on visualization, steerability, and pushability. But unfortunately, with conventional tools, we lack these. All right, some of the catheters allow for the deflection of the distal end of the catheter. They
Mhm.
give some steerability, but none of them really allow you to visualize in 3D relative to the target anatomy, allow you to provide the support needed for the wires or the devices, and allow you to precisely control the device tip with the precision that's needed. And just note that these are very small arteries, about
Yes.
3, 4, 5 millimeters in diameter, and you have a wire that's maybe 14 tau, maybe 30 tau, 35 tau, 30 tau. So based
Mhm.
on the dimension that you have for that wire and the um, the vessel, you need very precise manipulation and control at a very long length over a flexible device, which is very challenging with conventional tools. And that's and we actually did experiments and we have publications on that and showed that unlike what you would think, and the clinicians typically may think that you can control the tip of the device, what you end up doing is you're actually on the periphery of the artery or the vessel wall, because that's where your flexible device tends to sit
Mhm.
and gets support from the vessel wall itself. You're not truly actually at the center of that artery when you need to be. And as soon as, if you are at the center, as soon as you engage with anything stiff like an occlusion, then your wire or your catheter buckles on itself, because it doesn't have any support,
Mhm.
and it bends until it reaches the vessel wall. And these devices have to be soft and flexible because otherwise they would damage the vessel walls. But when they are soft and flexible, as soon as they engage with that stiff occlusion, they buckle on themselves. So those are some of the limitations of conventional tools and techniques, and how the CathPilot sort of was born to address these.
Okay. Let's go through this really interesting animation that you have on your website, and you can kind of guide us through this.
Sure.
That would be great.
Sure. So what you can see here is the concept of the CathPilot, which has this expandable frame that's biased to expand like a stent. Then using a set of cables that are anchored to this expandable frame, we're able to precisely manipulate that catheter tip relative to that frame. Now the idea is, in a typical revascularization procedure, you would get some sort of femoral access and you would try to navigate through that artery towards the target site. Initially, you would have a wire that's there, and then you would follow it with a delivery catheter or dilator, and you would try to obviously cross this occlusion with the wire. But as I said, here you can see in this animation, as the clinician is trying to manipulate it. Well, first of all, it's never this perfect in a sense
Right.
that it sits at the center of the artery. It sits, as I was saying, sits on the periphery of the artery. But
Mhm.
here you can see that the wire would buckle, and you don't have control over that tip of the device precisely. But what the CathPilot does with this expandable frame, mathematically, the way it works, it's an over-constrained system. And what that means is it has no option to go but to go to where we command it to, because it's over-constrained with those set of cables. Now,
Mhm.
the way the procedure would start is, you collapse that frame with a coupling mechanism. You would irrigate the system, then you would introduce it through a delivery catheter or a guiding catheter or a sheath. And then you would advance it. On the right side here, you can see the frame. And as
Mhm.
you retract that guiding catheter, the frame would expand and anchor onto that target lumen. Then the user manipulates the joystick on the device handle. It's very much like a joystick on any sort of PlayStation that you would have.
Mhm.
And that motion directly maps to the motion of the catheter. So it's very intuitive to use in that sense. As you would move it, you know exactly where it is in its workspace. But the other benefit is, because this is mathematically and mechanically over-constrained, by just looking at the displacement of those cables on the device handle, the user can track with sub-millimeter accuracy where they are and see where they are on Earth with that vessel lumen. So they can precisely guide the device instead of a random poke and
Mhm.
pray approach. Now they can systematically attempt crossing with sub-millimeter accuracy and guide the device to these penetrable segments of the occlusion. So sometimes, there's a lot of times actually, more than 50%, there's microchannels from one end of the lesion to the other, and this has been already proven. But unfortunately, these are very tight channels, and unless you're able to precisely position your wire, which is a very flexible device again, you are unable to cross them because your wire would buckle. And ideally, you want to go through these microchannels because you have the endothelial layer in there and your true lumen, and the risks
Mhm.
of restenosis of that occlusion is minimized once you do angioplasty. But you can't find them easily because, again, you need sub-millimeter positioning and support. So with the CathPilot, we allow for that you can find these. And if there's no microchannels, or if they're very extremely tight, there's also lipid sections that are, fatty, essentially soft segments of that occlusion that you can identify and find. But again, that would require systematic scanning or probing of the surface of
Mhm.
that occlusion for one to find that optimal penetration path. Because otherwise, with the studies that we've done, and we actually assess this technology with with actual human CTO samples, chronic total occlusion samples,
Mm-hmm.
and we compared the CathPilot head to head with those technology, with conventional technologies for crossing these occlusions. And what we found was with the conventional tools, obviously these were patients that were failed, amputated
Mm-hmm.
patients. With conventional tools, we only had a 12% success rate, which matched the clinical outcome of these poor patients who were amputated. But the CathPilot was able to cross those same lesions 91% of the time.
Hmm.
And again, this is the representation. This is again representation of the worst case scenario, worst cohort, because these are amputated patients. So it truly allows you to find these penetrable segments. The other thing that we found in that study, which was I think very important, was that conventional tools, because as I said, they sit on the periphery of the artery, they tend to perforate the vessel wall.
Oh.
Okay, and in other words, they're not going through lumen. But that only happened once with the CathPilot. It happened 9 times with the conventional tools in the same set of experiments. So we're able to drastically increase the success rate, but also do it safer, which is very important,
Yeah.
especially for down the road future applications like coronary applications, which we want to go after. The other thing is, we were just able to do that in 95 seconds on average with the CathPilot.
Hmm.
So you're able to very quickly scan the surface of that occlusion. And if there's a penetrable segment or microchannel, you can find it very quickly. So it makes it a lot more controlled and systematic. The clinicians obviously prefer to know where they are, have control, and have no risk factors to risk the life of the patient and the procedure outcome. So we think that CathPilot offers that.
Okay. One of the popular concepts in minimally invasive devices, because of tortuosity and complex CTOs, is this concept of anchoring, right? And you talk about support, and when you talk about support, you're kind of talking about anchoring in a way as well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. The expand is very similar to the stent structure, that sort of, and the concept has existed, and obviously you
Yeah.
need to watch out for the forces that you're applying to that vessel lumen because you don't want to damage it. And we've actually done initial animal models experiments
Mm-hmm.
that we show that there's no visible damage to the vessel wall or that endothelial layer. But this is sort of established sort of a concept in arterial procedures, at least, that you can anchor a stent or any other mechanism without any complications.
Right.
But our device is obviously temporary, but the benefit of
Mm.
this anchoring is that now, because we're anchoring at that local site, we're now locally manipulating the device relative to that target,
Yes.
which adds significant value. Again, when you compare it to the conventional tools where you're manipulating from a meter and a half away, approximately from outside the
Proximal.
body, now you're precisely manipulating distally at that tip, locally relative to the anatomy, and you know where things are relative to the anatomy, which is ultimately what you care about. You care
Yeah.
about that local target site and where things are relative to it. So that's the real advantage that allows you to manipulate and see where things are relative to that target structure.
Okay. Very interesting. And that frame, that self-expanding frame. When we talk about self-expanding, we're usually talking about nitinol, but this is a little different modality. I'm not sure if that's nitinol or not.
It is nitinol, but
Okay.
it's a very complex design, and it
Mm.
evolved over several years because it has several conflicting requirements. From one end, you would want it to expand on its own and anchor onto the vessel lumen without applying excessive force, and you want it to contract when you wish it to contract. So it has to be completely flexible. But from the other end, you don't want it to deflect as you're manipulating the device with the cables, because the
Mm.
cables are anchoring to that structure. So this has to be rigid when you're manipulating your catheter, but you also want it to contract. And it has to, obviously, it has to support these cables, very fine
Yeah.
cables, several tau in diameter, and pass them in an optimal orientation, so there's minimal friction and so forth. So there was a lot of obviously finite element analysis and simulation and evolution of the prototype to get it to. And there was actually had a recent publication that goes through that process because we thought it's valuable for the community to also be aware of, because we think this concept will probably have other applications in other minimally invasive procedures. Anytime you want to go through a long tortuous path, so you don't have to do an open incision and you want to do some surgical intervention, such a thing should be adding value. So we shared that as well with the academic community.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned how at some point there's a different applications coronary that this could be useful in complex tortuosity and CTO.
Even beyond coronary, frankly, we think
Mhm.
there's many other applications. Again, anytime you want to go through a minimally invasive, long, tortuous path,
Mm.
and this could be even for surgical applications, oncology applications, but a lot of other, obviously, aortic procedures, coronary procedures. So we think, that it's a platform technology because, again, it allows for this fundamental thing that we didn't have the luxury of before, to precisely manipulate and track a tip of a long, flexible
Yes.
device,
Yeah.
and do that with sub-millimeter tracking accuracy. And also give it the mechanical support, because that's a conflicting requirement that we usually didn't have, because either it's too long and flexible and you don't have support, but now you have that benefit while getting the support. So I mean, hopefully I can share a lot more in the future, but there's obviously a lot more activity and
Yeah.
that space for future applications.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks for going through all the technical aspects of this very novel design. And if you could kind of give us an update on where you are with preclinical, any, that
For
you're not in
sure.
human yet, but if you can kind of give us an update there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, when it comes to chronic total occlusions, because we humans ate a lot of junk food over many years,
Mhm.
and we only have a good model for them in humans samples. Like, we don't have good animal models for it. You can have other occlusions in animal models, but they're not truly representative of the heterogeneity of these occlusions that have long time formation and are calcified heavily and have fibrous tissue and sort of. So we don't. So unfortunately, the animal models only get us so far. So you can do safety and feasibility studies in animals, and we've already done some, and we'll do more in the latest prototype of our system. But what we think is the true gold standard, and one the thing that we are right now planning for to execute very soon, is actually to assess it within intact limb models. Because again, as I said, unfortunately,
Mm.
patients end up being amputated, and they're representative of the worst case scenarios. And if we're able to do testing within these limbs as soon as they're amputated and while they're fresh, then we can truly show, could we have salvaged this limb? Like, could have we, crossed the occlusion and revascularized and prevented this amputation? So that's one of the things on our list that we plan to do. But before that, we were doing a usability study, because the device in concept is quite different to conventional catheters, and I would say it's a disruption. So that requires a lot of usability testing to ensure that clinicians are actually comfortable working with this, because now it's a two-handed device. From one hand, you're manipulating the CathPilot. From the other hand, you're manipulating the guide wire or the other catheter that's going through it. So that requires, and there's also a graphic user interface that we didn't have
Mhm.
before. And so we've done a lot of ergonomic studies to optimize the shape of the handle and its design and the forces and so forth. But we want to do usability studies within repeatable models,
Yeah.
phantom models that have occlusions, and again, do the comparison of our tool to conventional tools to show that the usability scores higher, hopefully, and that the performance is higher as we expect with the previous studies. But then after that, we'll go jump into those full intact limb models, cadaver models, to show how hopefully we can cross, and this is in a way a great uh, feature to be able to have these testing results before going to living humans. right? Because
Yeah.
these are already amputated limbs. So hopefully, after that, obviously, we plan to do clinical studies, but we think if you're able to show it in those amputated limbs, it would be extremely valuable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to regrouping with you over time to see
Absolutely.
how these tests and these clinicals are working out and how the platform is used in other complex, challenging anatomy as well.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to sharing more in the future as well.
Yeah.